So my name's Tracy. I work with Cornell Cooperative Extension of Columbia and Greene counties. And this year, our organization has been working in partnership with the Nature Conservancy to develop a series of programming around forest carbon. So this is webinar 3. We kicked this off back in the beginning of October with a woods walk. And then we did a webinar on general forest management as it relates to carbon, understanding carbon in your backyard woods. And now we're here today to talk about demystifying forest carbon offsets with Ali Kosiba. And I'm just going to do a quick intro for Ali, and then I'll turn it over and let you take it away. So we're really excited to have Ali today, and I just wanted to share a little bit about who she is. So Ali is a forest ecophysiologist with an extension assistant professor and leader of the extension forestry program at the University of Vermont. She has taught forestry courses at the undergraduate and graduate levels, worked as a research scientist with the Forest Ecosystem Monitoring Cooperative, and served as the nation's first climate forester for the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources. In her current role at UVM Extension, she creates resources, conducts applied research to help landowners, foresters, policymakers, and the public across New England and New York understand how climate change and other stressors impact forests, as well as how forests contribute to climate mitigation through carbon sequestration and storage. All right, Ali, we're ready for you.
Great. Thanks, Tracy. And thanks everyone for being here. I have changed the title a little bit. I know that the title on the advertisement was Enrolling in Forest Carbon Offsets, and that might be an outcome that you choose after this, but I sort of want to lay out the information about forest carbon offsets and give you the resources and tools for you to decide. All right, so how this will be structured, I'm going to talk about sort of the problem we face and why carbon offsets exist. A couple carbon science terms, just all be on the same page. How carbon offsets work, the types of carbon offsets that exist, how these programs are structured, and then key criteria for carbon projects. And then I'll get into some considerations if you're a landowner or if you're a forester that works with landowners or just interested in these, what are some questions and considerations that you might want to bring to a carbon project to ask some questions. I'll also talk about other ways that you can get paid if you're a landowner or forester advising landowners on carbon benefits. And so I'll summarize with some take-home points, and we will have some times for question and answer at the end. All right, so the problem is that we are releasing CO2 and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere.
Hey, Ali,
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to let you know we can no longer see your presentation.
Oh, this is weird. Okay.
Lovely to look at you and the forest in the background, but we did just
So
have it up.
it just got lost. Interesting.
I guess the screen sharing's down.
Okay. Let's
There
try
it
the,
is.
thank you for letting me know. Is that good now?
That's beautiful.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, that's important to see.
Mhm.
All right. So you all are seeing this. So the problem we face is that we are emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So you see that with the blue line at the bottom. And that's really increased, since the early 1900s with industrialization. Burning of fossil fuels is the primary driver of those increased CO2 concentrations. Of course, there's other greenhouse gases. We're really talking about carbon dioxide here, and we'll find out that why in a second. But actually, what we're seeing in the atmosphere has been lessened or mitigated by natural ecosystems. So oceans have absorbed quite a bit of this excess carbon dioxide, as well as forests, grasslands, wetlands, other natural ecosystems that take in that carbon dioxide. And we have a phrase for that. We call it climate mitigation. Basically, that it's lessening those natural ecosystems through those processes are lessening that impact and lessening the amount of carbon dioxide that is in the atmosphere. And we have an issue now that has arisen with fossil fuel emissions is that entities, countries, states, individuals are looking to lessen their emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. And sometimes these emissions take time to lessen, take innovation or a lot of capital to lessen. And so there is this desire to become what's called net zero. And you can be net zero in a number of different ways. We're talking here about carbon emissions, carbon dioxide emissions. And so that really means that the amount of CO2 that is emitted to the atmosphere is balanced by the amount that's removed from the atmosphere. And you can see that this is some diagrams of countries that have net zero targets. Individual states have net zero targets, and then a lot of corporations and companies have net zero targets. These are just a couple examples, but there's many other examples of net zero targets that companies have laid out. And so one of the ways that folks are looking to get to these net zero targets is by harnessing the natural power of our ecosystems, specifically our trees and our forests. And that's because trees are exceptional about taking in, sequestering carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing that carbon in their wood, in roots, in leaves, and eventually in soil. And so one nice fact about trees is that half the dry weight of wood is carbon that was removed from the atmosphere by that growing tree. So a couple quick terms when we talk about carbon science. I'm going to introduce, you've heard me mention these, you've probably heard these before, but just to get on the same page, carbon storage is the amount of carbon in an entity. So we can talk about the carbon in a tree, carbon in an acre of forest, carbon in a wood product, cord of wood, because that carbon is still stored in that wood product for as long as that product is in use. So I use the analogy here. This is money in your piggy bank, your savings account, checkings account today. And then carbon sequestration is a process. It's a rate. So it's the process of taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere by living plants, some other ways this can happen, but taking that carbon dioxide out and storing it. And so the analogy with the bank account is this is like your deposits. So some days, some months, some years, you deposit more, some you deposit less. As you deposit, as you sequester, your carbon storage grows. The other side of this coin is carbon emissions. So this is a process of emitting carbon dioxide back out into the atmosphere. It's really the opposite of sequestration. It's like withdrawals from your bank account. So if you withdraw more than you deposit, your carbon storage declines. If you deposit more than you withdraw, it increases. And really the same is true for carbon storage. I should mention with carbon emissions, it's very natural that we have carbon emissions in a forest and our ecosystem. So it happens with just natural metabolic processes of all living organisms, plants and insects, animals, everything that lives in the forest and on the world uses carbon for its energy source and emits some carbon dioxide back out into the atmosphere. We also get carbon emissions from events like forest fire. So when we talk about carbon benefits of a forest, there's actually two ways we can sort of enhance or manage or think about forests. And I will say they're not exclusive, but it's helpful to think about them separately. We often do actions that will do both. So we first have active sequestration. This is the idea we want to take more carbon out of the atmosphere. So we're taking more carbon out of the atmosphere. And then the other side is avoiding emitting carbon to the atmosphere. And so some examples of active sequestration, maybe we plant trees in an area doesn't have trees, that's marginal farmland or the edge of farmland or a yard, allowing areas to naturally reforest on their own. That gives active sequestration in a place where there wasn't a lot of it prior to that. We can get this benefit by managing forests for improved health. So this might be, thinning a stand of trees that are unhealthy and leaving the healthy ones, and we get more active sequestration in the future after that. Thinning trees to grow bigger, giving them more space and resources, and promoting attributes in our forests like species diversity. Because we know when we have more diverse forests, we actually have species that can occupy different ecological niches in that forest and we get more active sequestration. Examples of avoiding emissions. Biggest one, avoiding loss of forest. So that's conversion of forest to a non-forest use. We can do things like extending the time between active timber harvest, so lengthening what we would call a rotation. We can harvest wood for longer used products, so more durable products. So instead of harvesting wood for paper, we grow trees that could go into structural materials for buildings. And then when we use wood over higher energy intensive products, higher greenhouse gas emitting products, we actually get benefits from that too. And those are permanents. We're avoiding the emissions of using maybe steel or concrete when we use wood. So landowners now are eligible, in many cases, not all landowners, not in every place, but to sell these benefits as what we call carbon offsets. So how this works, say there's an entity, I'm depicting this as a factory that has carbon dioxide emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. They will pay a landowner to do something. So maybe they are going to protect their forest. They were going to sell their land and subdivide it, develop it, but they're going to protect their forest and keep that carbon in the forest. So avoiding emissions, maybe they're going to do some activities that enhance sequestration. And like I said, there's many benefits that happen with both. So protecting a forest would actually help avoid emissions, and it does provide the continued sequestration benefit as well. And then basically the entity gets a carbon offset. It's really a token piece of paper. You can't actually buy the carbon. You're essentially buying the carbon rights. It's a little bit like buying timber rights or mineral rights from a land. So they're essentially buying that carbon right. And they can then sort of offset, cancel out their emissions 1-to-1. And the key here is that one carbon offset does equal a measured amount of carbon dioxide. It's a metric ton, which is sort of a weird amount because it's a gas, right? But gases do have weight. And so we measure that as a metric ton. It's a little over 2,000 pounds of carbon dioxide is one offset. So carbon offsets have a very nested structure that I'll talk about. So we start off with carbon markets. These are virtual exchanges where carbon offsets are bought and sold. We have carbon registries under that, and these are entities that issue, hold, and transfer the carbon offsets, and they also set the methodology for how to estimate the number of offsets that a forest or another project would generate. And then we also have carbon developers. So these are companies that help a landowner develop a carbon project, and they monetize the offsets. They can enroll projects in different registries and different markets. I'll give it some examples of each of those classifications. So carbon markets, we have two big categories here in the United States and actually in the world, is that you have a regulated, what we call compliance market. And so these are government regulated by states or even countries for carbon trading. Basically, the concept is that they set targets, allowances for polluters, and those polluters are able to buy a certain amount of offsets in a carbon market. And usually that allowance decreases over time to incentivize reductions in emissions. So an example is California's cap and trade program. Most of carbon offsets that are traded and sold in the country are in what we call a voluntary carbon market. It's free market, not regulated, and sometimes not always easy to find the information because of that. Within those carbon markets, as I mentioned, there's registries. So these are registries that they set protocols for how a carbon offset project is developed, how the amount of offsets generated are verified. They help sell the carbon offsets through these different markets. They're not required in the voluntary market, but they do help allow for sort of trust and integrity to be built in the voluntary market. So most programs are involved with a registry and have a methodology that is approved by a registry. And so you see under that ARB, GS, etc. Those are examples of different carbon registries that exist. And there's probably others. Those are sort of the major ones. And so you can see at the bottom examples of some of these methodologies on the bottom left. They're very technical. They really have to set out protocols for how do you measure? How do you verify? What is the long-term trajectory and how do you verify that the carbon that you said was there is there? And I will say this, carbon offsets are not just for forests, that's what I'll be talking about, but they cover a lot of different topical areas as well. The nice thing about registries is they have public portals where you can see the number of offsets bought and sold, and you can look at the methodology and the documentation from those projects. Well, say this differs a little bit in the voluntary market. Some of this information isn't as easily accessed or transparent. So nested under that are these carbon developers. So these can be private or nonprofit companies. And these are really the ones, if you're thinking as a landowner, you might want to enroll in a carbon offset program. This is who you're going to be working with, is one of these developers. They are the ones that set up the project, that figure out how many carbon offsets are available to be sold, and they sell those offsets and then provide you with some share of the profit. And there's a big range and availability based on geographic location, where you are in the country, what kind of forest you have, and then really it comes down to how many acres you have. Really, carbon offsets have been limited to large forest land holdings, upwards of 3,000 acres. Only in the last couple of years have there been programs for smaller landowners. They still, for the most part, I think the smallest go down to 30 to 40 acres. There are 3 different categories of actions that are eligible for forest carbon offsets. The first, afforestation, reforestation, basically tree planting or allowing forests to regrow. So carbon offsets are generated through the carbon storage in newly planted trees. So they can either be non-forested sites or forested sites. That's the afforestation, reforestation, but the concept is still the same, still really the same. The second is avoided deforestation. So this means that carbon offsets are generated by preventing the conversion of forested land to non-forested land. And then the third category, which is likely going to be what many landowners in our region are going to be eligible for or interested in, is what we call, or what carbon projects call, improved forest management. And so that means that carbon offsets are generated through forest management activities that increase or at a minimum maintain the current level of carbon storage over time. So what is improved forest management? It really just means managing forest for improved carbon benefits. So it doesn't necessarily include, it's a little bit of a vague term, and some folks don't like this term because it sounds maybe like it's doing more than it is, but it's really focusing on the carbon benefits. And in general, there's really only 2 strategies that are used by carbon developers, is to delay harvest, usually for the length of the contract. That might mean really no harvest. If your contract length is 20 years, you cannot harvest in that 20-year period. There is some allowances usually for firewood for personal use, clearing trails from downed trees, but other than that, you're not harvesting. And then the second category is harvest less than what you plan to over that time frame. And so, this sort of gets into the nitty-gritty of carbon offsets, but it's really important to understand the integrity of carbon offsets. And it really is important because a carbon offset, as I mentioned, it's not a physical object that's bought and sold. Really, it's a token that you're representing the carbon. And importantly, it is used to offset actual emissions made elsewhere. So we really have to be careful that what we say is happening in the forest, those offsets generated, is equal to the emissions that it is counteracting, right? Because what we care about is, I use this phrase, what does the atmosphere see? That's what we're thinking about when we're thinking about climate change mitigation. We want to affect the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So we want to make sure that those numbers are equal or as equal as possible. And so this means the measurement, the tracking, the evaluation of forest carbon benefits must adhere to strict criteria. And I will say there's a little wiggle room in the voluntary market as far as how folks address each one of these 5 criteria. And these are usually set by the carbon registry. And I'll talk about each one of these briefly. So real is that reductions in emissions or increases in carbon sequestration have to be tangible, right? This makes sense. So what this means is that an offset must represent a measurable amount of carbon dioxide that was not emitted to the atmosphere or was sequestered. And so how this happens, large parcels, especially those ones mentioned in that California compliance market, or even large parcels in the voluntary market, they usually have really extensive forest inventory that happens on the ground with measurements, people measuring trees, and all sorts of aspects of that forest. And then that's re-inventoried periodically. That's not usually cost effective or possible with smaller land holdings. And so what we see in smaller land holdings, there's various options that folks are trying out to see what works. So example is that they might use a subset of projects and they sample on those. They might compare what's happening in your forest to some forest inventory plots that exist elsewhere, long-term inventory plots, or they might use satellite imagery to verify what's happening on the property. Regardless, all parcels and projects that are selling carbon offsets, they do need to deduct for leakage to make sure that what we say is an offset and what's happening in the forest is real. And what is leakage? So it's really important concept of carbon offsets. It's when we reduce harvesting in one place to store more carbon, to provide carbon benefits, but wood is harvested elsewhere. That negates those intended carbon benefits. And there's sort of two types of leakage. We have activity shifting leakage. This is really within one landowner. So say as a landowner, I own multiple parcels. I enroll one parcel and then harvest twice as much on the other parcel. That negates the carbon impact that I was intending to have with enrolling that one parcel. And the way programs get around this is by, as a landowner, I would either have to declare all those parcels or enroll all of those parcels. So that's a little bit easier to deal with. The harder one is what we call market leakage. So this is that if more and more landowners enroll in carbon projects and delay harvest or harvest less, the amount of wood coming out of an area, especially an area like New York and New England, where we produce a lot of wood, might mean that there is more harvesting that happens elsewhere. And again, that sort of negates that carbon benefit. It might even have bigger carbon benefits if those wood products have longer transportation distances or more area needs to be harvested to meet those wood demands. And so the way carbon offset programs address this is they usually have a deduction for leakage. There's a lot of questions of whether that amount is appropriate and how to accurately identify that. But this is one of the big questions or concerns about carbon offsets. Second criteria is also a big area of concern and conversation is additional or additionality. And so this means that reductions in emissions or increases in carbon storage must occur beyond a baseline. And they can't be a part of a prior legal commitment. What this means is that offsets generated must be more than what would have happened anyway. And so what this means is that your land, if you want to enroll, cannot have a legal restriction to store carbon. You have to own the timber rights. And this is something to consider if you have a conservation easement. Usually those allow for timber harvesting, but if your conservation easement does not allow for timber harvesting, you will likely not be able to enroll in a carbon offset market because you don't have the ability to harvest that wood. You cannot sell carbon from the same land more than once, which is important. So this does preclude often enrolling in different programs back to back. And you have to, this is where the carbon developer comes in, you have to show that you've had a greater carbon benefit compared to something. So some baseline or common practice that other landowners like you might do, business as usual scenario, you have to have something to compare to show improved carbon benefit or additional carbon benefit. And I'll show you two quick schematic examples of how we do this or how carbon developers do this additionality. Um, we call this a counterfactual because we can't really prove whether it happens or not. But so, for example, you have your forest on the left, and this is the carbon stored in that forest right just today. And so you model, or the developer will model the carbon storage over time. Maybe that allows for a small harvest. You can see halfway through of some wood material. Or maybe that is some sort of event that happened that affected the carbon, like a windstorm. And then they compare that carbon storage to what a typical landowner would do. And really, you often model this with a profit-driven scenario. So if a landowner really wanted to maximize the profit from their forest, what would they do and what would that carbon look like? And so maybe that is a very drastic harvest, and then there's a regrowth, maybe another harvest. And so that's what that carbon benefit looks like over time. And so the difference between those two lines is the additional carbon on your land compared to this other hypothetical landowner. And you can sell that as carbon offsets. And so that difference is what we call additionality. Another example some carbon developers are using is comparing the carbon in your forest to some long-term inventory plots that are similar in forest type. So again, we have, our forest, that's a carbon benefit. And then we look at other, forests across the area that are similar composition, similar soil types, and we look at the carbon in those stands. And again, that difference in the two line, that's the amount that you can sell as carbon offsets. There will be some deduction from that amount of carbon that you can sell. That is, I mentioned leakage, and there's another deduction they'll talk about, sort of like an insurance pool. So the third principle of carbon offsets is that they must be verifiable. And so that reductions in emissions or increasing carbon sequestration has to be measurable in some way. And usually this is by a third-party system or some sort of standardized system. And so this is different within each registry, but usually they establish protocols to follow for how to measure and verify carbon. Again, these really technical documents, if you want to pore through them, they can be very hard to navigate. And they might require a third-party verification or remote sensing verification with satellite imagery. And so programs for smaller landowners have a challenge doing some of these things at scale just because, it's different if you have a 5,000 acre parcel and a 50-acre parcel. And so the way they verify is usually on a subset. I mentioned satellite imagery, some other way to make this easier and more cost effective. The fourth category is that carbon benefits need to be permanent. So we don't want carbon benefits to just be immediately released after we've sold those benefits as offsets, right? And so how we do that, programs usually require a long contract. There is one project program that's doing 5 years. I would say most are 20, 40, or over 100 years. And that's how they get that permanence, is that they are, monitoring that carbon benefit for a very, very long time and require the landowner to do something during that time frame. And then I mentioned this insurance pool. So many programs require landowners to set aside some of the carbon benefits. So some of those offsets they've generated through that additionality into what we call a buffer pool. So this is to allow for an insect outbreak that might kill some trees, or this photo here showing a windstorm, right? And that's not to any fault of the landowner. And so we put away a portion of the offsets into this buffer pool that can be used. So it's like an insurance pool for some of these unintended reversals is the technical way we talk about those. And then the other thing landowners should be really aware of is that if you as a landowner want to leave the program, there are often consequences to that. And we call those intentional reversals. So if you want to terminate the contract early, or if you harvest more than you are allowed to in the contract, you're often responsible for reimbursing for any offsets sold. So just something to be really aware of, especially with some of these longer contracts, is that you are selling the carbon rights in your forest, and there are legal obligations to those agreements. And one thing that's important to recognize, and I, as someone who works with forest ecology and forest health, is really interested in is how, this buffer pool idea, this insurance pool where you put some of your offsets in, is it large enough to account for some of the disturbances we see? So example of hemlock woolly adelgid, forest tent caterpillar, other spongy moth, as well as catastrophic forest fire. We're seeing out in some of the Pacific Northwest, California carbon projects that potentially there might not be enough offsets set aside into this buffer pool to account for some of these changes that are climate driven in our forests. And we are seeing this. This is, a tagline I saw in a paper or an online article, that some of these insects are causing really large carbon losses and carbon emissions. So it's just something where, the carbon offset world is evolving and thinking about how to set aside enough offsets in this buffer pool to account for some of these unintended events. And the last category here is this idea of being enforceable. And so they can only be counted once, your carbon benefits, and only sold once. So this means that usually those offsets are really well tracked, so that trading of an offset, it only happens once. I will say that an entity that buys an offset, if they don't use that offset for their own emissions, they can resell it. So that happens a lot, but registries give each offset a unique serial number, allows it to be tracked, and they do have these online databases. I will say that markets like the California compliance market make it a lot easier to track than some of the voluntary markets. It's a little bit harder to find some of the information, but the assurance is that they are tracking this and just not making it publicly available. Oh, big question lots of folks have. You might have this. How much does an offset sell for? How much, money can I make as a landowner selling the carbon benefits? And I will say it's incredibly variable. It's really hard to give a straight answer for that. It's a volatile market, and it really varies depending on the type of project, the market with which you're selling, and the demand. So that's how much an entity is willing to pay. So on the left, we have that compliance carbon market. Remember, that's one set by governments. So the price is set by a market. The California Cap and Trade program that's set by the California Air Resources Board. Currently, one single offset, metric ton of carbon dioxide, goes for a little over $38. Compare that to the voluntary market, again, not set by governments, not regulated. And this is also, you cannot get full prices on what people pay. It's really what we find for prices that folks buy offsets for is voluntary reporting by brokers and buyers. So we don't know. There could be prices that offsets that go for much more than this and are not disclosed. But it really does come down to it's a free market. It's what buyers will pay. And so that does depend on the other values that are associated with that project. So forest carbon projects can be actually quite attractive because they might have other benefits like for wildlife, for biodiversity, for water infiltration and flood reduction, right? But the marketing of those offsets is really important, and that depends on, how much a buyer will pay. Right now, the current price is about $10. But again, it varies a lot by the type of offset. afforestation, reforestation projects tend to go for more because it's really easy to see that there are trees in the ground and that they're growing, versus some of the other improved forest management might be a little bit harder to see what the change in that additionality is. There is some anecdotal evidence that some projects in our region offsets have sold for well over $20 an offset. Again, it's incredibly variable and quite volatile from year to year as well. I will say that this is both prices are substantially lower than what economists set and what our federal government has set as the social cost of carbon. So that is the estimated cost of climate damage from 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide being released to the atmosphere. And currently that's set by our federal administration at $51 per metric ton, which again is an offset. So you can see for both of those, and particularly the voluntary carbon market, is much lower than that. And there's a lot of folks that think those offset prices need to come up to really incentivize change and reduction in fossil fuel emissions. So you probably are wondering what projects or programs are available to you. There aren't a lot available to smaller landowners in the Northeast region. And by smaller, I'm saying anything under 3,000 acres. It might even be higher than that, under 5,000 acres. Right now, really, this is it. And there might be other ones that have limited application or are coming online. It's a very rapidly changing landscape. So the Family Forest Carbon Program, which is a joint program between the American Forest Foundation, the Nature Conservancy, might be an option. They're not open to every forest type, and you do need to have certain criteria that are met in your forest as far as number of trees and density. And then Forest Carbon Works and Chestnut Carbon have a program together that is actively enrolling landowners here in our region. And I believe for both of these, the minimum acreage is 40 acres. So similarities, landowners paid for keeping more carbon in the woods compared to some benchmark. Another entity is buying those credits, those offsets, to offset emissions made elsewhere. Differences, what management activities are allowed, what forest types are allowed to enroll, the length of the contract, how carbon is estimated and verified, if wood products that you harvest are included in that additionality, if the landowner must contribute to an insurance pool, how much the carbon offsets sell for, and if there are restrictions on who is able to buy those offsets. So you can see there's a lot more differences than there are similarities. Each of these programs really sets its own methodology and that ways they can do these projects in ways it sets up and measures offsets. So I will say, because of these complexities and differences, I really, really encourage landowners to ask a lot of questions before signing up. These contracts can be confusing. You may want to have a lawyer look at them. You may want to talk to an accountant thinking about how are you going to be taxed on this revenue. And as I said, that a lot of this is developing. And so it's really good to be informed, especially for some of these long contracts, but regardless of any length contract, understanding what it means for your land and what you can and can't do on that land. So asking questions laid out here, what types of management activities am I allowed to do? Do I have to enroll all the land I have? Will someone visit my property and measure the trees in my forests? What happens if I sell my land? Does the contract stay with the land, or am I responsible for it? If I exit the contract early, are there penalties? Or what happens if there's a natural disturbance? What happens if the carbon developer goes bankrupt or ceases to exist? Is the contract dissolved, or is there some transfer? How frequently will a landowner get paid? Some of them pay annually, some pay upfront and then at the end. So it really differs. And you can ask about expected revenue for your land, as well as things like ensuring the integrity of a carbon offset. And it might be of interest to you who is allowed or who is not allowed to buy carbon offsets. For example, whether you feel comfortable having a fossil fuel company buy offsets off your land, that could be something that's important to you. So in general, thinking about offsets, selling offsets, and other programs you might be enrolled in on your land. In general, they're compatible, but landowners should be really cautious and ask some questions, especially of a forest professional. So example, like forest legacy program or conservation easements, generally they align. I'd make sure if you are thinking about enrolling a carbon offset program, give your conservation easement contract to the developer to look through. Those are all very different. Again, I mentioned if there is a restriction on timber harvesting, then that might be a different scenario. So any encumbrance that you have on your land could pose conflicts. And remembering that you can't sell offsets twice. And so enrolling in programs back to back can involve a waiting period or just might be prohibitive. Um, and thinking about compatibility with state-specific programs. So this is an example that I received from the Family Forest Carbon Program, specifically for landowners in New York State. And as you can see, there's programs listed on the left. And in those bright colors are the two options that the Family Forest Carbon Program has for enrollment. So grow older forest is really a no harvest scenario for the length of the contract. And enhance your woodland is allows for active management, but a pretty light management and timber harvest level. And so you can see that there's some varying compatibility with different programs there. And so, my advice here would be seek out the advice from a forester, if that's a stewardship forester, the state extension forester, consulting forester, really, talk to folks and make sure you know what you're getting into. So you're not kicked out of another program by enrolling in a carbon offset program. So thinking if it's right for you, that length of contract can be something that people stumble with. So I mentioned there's 5 year. That's not really available in our region right now. I think the shortest contract available in our region is 20 years. Legal and tax implications is important to think about. Restrictions on future management. So you are signing up for a long-term contract, just thinking about what that means for you in 15 years. Recognizing that carbon markets are evolving and the price of carbon offsets is not set. So even if you roll today, you might make more money in the future if the price goes up, or you might make less if the price goes down. And then another thing to think about, if it's important to you, is whether you're actually making a climate impact, which it varies really based on a lot of conditions. So, a lot of people ask this, like, do carbon offsets help mitigate climate change? And I wish the answer was like emphatically yes, but it depends on a lot of factors. So, I mean, they're really set out to offset actual emissions elsewhere. So the intent is to reduce the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so that can happen. Really great benefit of carbon offsets is the fact that they do have long contracts. And so these can help protect forests. They can help keep forests as forests, which we know in our region, we're losing forests to development and other land uses all the time. So this is really, really important benefit of carbon offset projects. And if it allows that forest to be managed differently, resulting in more carbon in the forest or in wood products, again, that's a great benefit for the atmosphere. However, it might not provide the intended climate mitigation benefits if that land was not at risk of conversion, right? So if there wasn't anything at risk there, so that's not really additionality. Oops. Oh, and if the management doesn't change, you say you're not really going to change anything and you enroll in a carbon offset market, you're using that benefit to offset actual emissions made elsewhere. And so that doesn't help the atmosphere. And then the other thing is if market forces result in equal or greater carbon impacts elsewhere. And that's that leakage aspect that's really hard for us to know really what's happening. And so, again, this is really out of a lot of the landowners control some of these things, but really making sure that this carbon offset program helps you keep the land forested. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to or change your management with this revenue. And so it's important just to recognize, I don't have data for New York. I apologize. This is just for New England. But I imagine the trend is the same in New York, is that in New England we harvest less wood than we use. And so it's important for us to recognize if we don't harvest wood here, where are resources coming from and at what cost? So what is that? What does the atmosphere see when we import wood from elsewhere, from other countries? What's the human rights and justice, the environmental rights impacts? How does this impact our local economy if we continue to outsource these wood demands? And so, just to say that there's a lot of debate over carbon offsets right now. I do think this is a good thing. There's a lot of conversation about carbon offsets, particularly that additionality, leakage, and permanence. And so I do think this means that there's a lot of smart people working on carbon offsets, and they will continue to evolve, excuse me, and hopefully improve. And I will say, just to leave you with some other options, is that landowners can manage for carbon regardless of if you sell those benefits as offsets or not. And so I really encourage folks to add carbon, add climate as goals in their forest management plan, work with a forester to incorporate those, and they can really be complementary to other goals you have, like wildlife biodiversity, timber, growing good timber resources, recreation, forest health. And I encourage folks to avoid focusing only on maximizing a single goal, like really just singly focusing on carbon. It could have detrimental effects, really thinking holistically about our forests and what's, good for their ecology and health. And we can include carbon in that suite of goals. So the best outcomes really do occur when we use multi-objective management, and we think about the ecological functioning of that forest. And so some ways we can use carbon-focused forestry, number one, protecting, conserving forests can be working forests, but making sure it doesn't get developed into other land uses. Then other things we can do to enhance the ecological functioning of our forests, like creating opportunities for a greater age class diversity, complexity of our forests and diversity, promoting vigor and stand growth, and thinking when we do harvest in places that are higher risk of disturbances, maybe need some interventions to improve their health. Keeping large trees on site, they are great for carbon storage. They're also a seed source. They're excellent for wildlife. Having areas of active management and passive management in a landscape really promotes both sequestration and storage benefits. Things like deadwood, and of course, minimizing disturbances to soil, really, really important for carbon-focused forestry. And then thinking too about how we can harvest wood for more long-lived products and reduce our dependency on things like steel and concrete and fossil fuels. And while I'll say all of these strategies can help rehabilitate forests and also reduce vulnerabilities and increase resilience to climate change. So things in particular like species diversity and age class complexity are really important for thinking about resilience in our forests to disturbances and climate change and other stressors. And so this is really important when we think about our forest landscape, because we have a lot of forests that have been impacted by a range of things. Degradation from past land use, maybe there were old agricultural field that grew, maybe there was grazing, perhaps there's insects and diseases or introduced plants. Intensive deer browse is an issue. I know in New York State, as it is here in Vermont, climate change as well as future land use changes are all threats to our forests. And so we can use thoughtful and ecologically based forest management to enhance some of these. And there's some photos of showing some of this complexity and structure. Having dead wood on our forest floor and as standing trees has a number of important benefits. And one thing I like and I really promote from this kind of strategy is having more resilient forest carbon. So it's forest carbon benefits now, but as we create more resilient forests, we help provide those carbon benefits in the future that are not as vulnerable to loss if we have a windstorm, an insect outbreak, or some other event. And we do know from research, we do know these provide better carbon benefits. So the example on the right is a forest with more structural diversity. That means it has trees of different sizes and different canopy levels, and it provides greater carbon benefits. So if you're interested in these sort of practices, there are cost share programs that are available that help you pay for this management. Reach out to a forester in New York or your local NRCS, so that's Natural Resources Conservation Services um, office. They can help you with technical assistance with a forest management plan and help actually pay partially for some of these practices. So really great if you have invasive species. If you want to do some of this enhancement for resilience, you can get some cost share. And New York State does have a couple programs that are available to New Yorkers only. So this Regenerate New York Forestry Cost Share Program, you can see there's eligible actions down below. So that afforestation, reforestation idea, but forest stand regeneration, competing vegetation control. So introduced species and deer exclosures, which is very cool. As deer eat a lot of our young regenerating trees and plants. So again, reach out to someone, a stewardship forester, for information on that program if you're interested. So just to summarize, really carbon offsets are intended to help entities reduce net emissions. The money generated can help, landowners, help fund conservation, sustainable forest management and restoration, which is really great. It is a way for the private sector to help fund this kind of work. I will say the options are growing rapidly. There are still a lot of unknowns. And so because they're difficult to navigate and understand, really, really encourage folks ask lots of questions, get advice, talk to multiple people. There are a lot of benefits to selling carbon offsets. It could be a big change to our current forest economy here in the Northeast. And there is, that's just a big unknown. And so I will say, they're going to continue to evolve as well as cost share programs. And so, keep your eye on resources from, Extension, Cornell Extension, from nonprofit partners, from the state of New York, from other, entities around. I'll plug a couple of my resources. So, check out UVM Extension Forestry. I have a section on carbon. I have a section on climate change. I have this guide to forest carbon in the Northeast. You can download it as a PDF. Molly Hassett and other folks at New York State, DC also have a whole bunch of hard copies that are free. And so if you would like a hard copy, I can connect you to her. If reach out to Molly. And we also have this website, Northeast Forest Carbon, that's the New England and New York states together. And we try to provide a clearinghouse of information on all things carbon science and forest, but also carbon offsets. And so with that fire hose of information, I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
Great. Thank you so much, Allie. That was fantastic. And I just wanted to say I really appreciate, both the forest carbon offset information and then like just the scaling back and big picture and thinking about the state of our forests and management of those holistically. Fantastic. So we do have quite a few questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we'll start at the top and just work our way down. If you want, I can read them out to you and then you can verbally respond.
Are these in the chat or the Q&A?
They're in the Q&A.
Okay, let me see. I don't know if I can see the Q&A. Oh, wait, yes. Okay,
Okay.
yes. Oh boy. Anthony asks how many of these carbon market programs are managed by private equity and not a more benevolent environmental manager? I don't know the answer to that. If that is a concern of yours, maybe going for one that's managed by, a nonprofit organization. But yeah, I'm not. I'm a forest scientist. Even talking about carbon offsets, sometimes I feel like I'm treading into the economic world a little too much. So sorry, I don't have an answer for you for that. Maybe someone else does. I will say a couple other sources of information. Penn State has a really good carbon program too, and so they provide a lot of information. Penn State Extension. So checking out if they have anything. But yeah, great question. I don't know. And how many carbon developers are working in the Hudson Valley? So I think really, if you're a smaller landowner, it's really those two options, that family forest carbon program, and then It's the conserve program, which is chestnut carbon and forest carbon work. So I would suggest reaching out to those two groups if you're interested. I will say, they do have some criteria based on what lands are eligible to enroll. So even if you're in a geographic area that they are enrolling, your specific parcel might not be eligible. So just be aware of that. I will say in that carbon guide, I plugged that I do talk a little bit about that, like some of the criteria about, because it is based on forest type, stocking, which is basically how many trees per acre you have. There's some of those criteria that are important, and accessibility has to be able to be harvested. So if you don't have access to the land, it's often not eligible. All right, Anthony asks, is there a time in a tree's or a forest lifetime where they're most beneficial to carbon sequestration? Do older trees ultimately benefit less because the trees may not be functioning as well? There is, I do have some information if I present a lot on forest carbon science sort of generally. And so I do have some webinars that are pre-recorded. If you go to the UVM extension page, I have a YouTube site and a whole section in there on carbon science. And so I talk about this and get into this in detail, but generally forests accrue carbon. So they continue to store carbon well into the old stages. And old growth forests, the few that we have in our region, we do know they store the most carbon. However, there's variability because forests in our region have disturbances. That's just a natural part of how forests develop. And so, an older young forest could be subject to a windstorm, an insect outbreak, and that affects the carbon. When we look at carbon sequestration, so remember that's the rate that those trees are taking in carbon and that carbon is getting stored in that forest. Generally, we see that peaks when forests are sort of like what we would call young to middle age. So maybe like 25 to 80. It really depends on the forest type, the site, all sorts of conditions. And that's just because those trees are really rapidly growing tall. That's the stage in development when trees are racing to light, trying to establish their canopy dominance. And you don't have as many trees dying at that stage as forests mature and develop. Trees die. Some trees survive and get bigger, so you have fewer trees in an area. If you have one big tree versus a lot of small trees, and so it gets more complex, but I say we need all of them. We need all stages and we need all conditions of forests. And so, we don't really want to focus just on storage or just on sequestration. There's benefits to having both. And all forests are doing both as well. Just some, depending on the age, will maybe have more storage than sequestration versus a young to middle-aged forest will be doing a lot more sequestration. So Susan has a question. Isn't it important for forest regeneration over the long term to engage selectively in cutting trees to allow saplings to have sufficient light to grow? And so the question about these markets that require no cutting, might not be the best for long-term health and viability. Yes, and yes, you are correct in some situations, and it really depends. I really encourage foresters, landowners, managers to really think about there's no one size fits all to forest management. It really depends on the forest condition and characteristics. And so, I showed some of those examples of forests that maybe have vulnerabilities and difficulties in development because of past land use or because of stressors they are encountering. So, an example of that I've seen is, a white ash forest. So white ash are threatened and dying from emerald ash borer, which is an introduced insect. And I've seen these forests with just an understory of invasive and introduced plants. So, honeysuckle, buckthorn, barberry underneath. And so as that overstory dies, if there's no younger trees to take over, we're seeing some of these places are becoming an invasive shrubland, right? So they're transitioning out of forest. And so you lose that carbon benefit, right? Carbon storage and future sequestration. You also lose all those other important benefits that a forest provides that an invasive shrubland is not going to provide. And so, likely a carbon developer might not want to enroll that stand, but it is important to think about. That's why I think I use this term resilient forest carbon is thinking about that long-term trajectory. Is that forest resilient to stressors and climate change? And we know that things like having different age classes in a forest and different species of trees allows that forest different pathways. So not all disturbances affect all ages of trees and all species of trees the same. And it is, the question asker is correct, is that many trees do need light and space to regenerate. And so it requires us to remove some trees or fell and leave some trees to create light if we want to encourage regeneration. I do see in a lot of forests where you're lacking regeneration because of past land use, perhaps grazing of animals. Deer browse is a really big impact on regeneration. And so it is a concern I have of if we do get a stressor that affects the overstory, what's the trajectory of many of our forests?
Ellie, I'm just going to pop in real quick and say that we are at the hour mark. I'm happy to stay on and continue with the questions as long as you are. But in case folks need to pop off, I just wanted to say quickly that while this has been a series of 3 different webinars, we've taken recordings of all of them, and a package will be put together for all attendees, whether you signed up for one or all 3, and we'll package all of those recorded webinars and associated resources and get a link out to you shortly. So I know there's just been a lot of questions about getting recordings out to folks. So I wanted to let everyone know you will have access to those.
Great. I'll answer a few more questions. I got do a couple minutes if people want to stay on. There is a question about the price. I mentioned that $10 for an offset in the voluntary market. There's a question of per year, per contract period. So that's per offset. So it really depends on what that carbon benefit of your land is, how many offsets you'll generate. I believe that the Family Forest Carbon Program, they pay actually a flat rate to landowners. So if you're enrolled in that growing older forest, which is a no harvest, or enhancing your woodland, which is active timber management, but a light timber management, there's 2 different prices over that 20-year period. And I think it's, ooh, don't know exactly. It's something around $300 an acre for that period. So, I will say that, it's not going to be a huge windfall selling carbon offsets from a small parcel because it really is based on that additionality, so the number of offsets you generate, but also the number of acres because it's, multiplies out. And so this is why historically carbon offsets have really been focused on larger landowners, not only about the measurement verification, but also just like the number of offsets generated. And so, yeah, really, it's hard to say exactly how much landowner would make in some of the other programs because it does depend on your additionality and the number of acres. Um, so there's a question, if you don't qualify for land amount, like the minimum land acreage, can you co-join with contiguous landowners? There's a couple examples of that happening. In fact, there's one that happened in Vermont. They've been so challenging to do, I think, to create because you have multiple landowners, you have to get an agreement and lots of legalese and things like that. So I don't know that anybody's doing that right now of pulling together multiple landowners. Now it's usually single landowners, but the way that folks or the way the developers are reducing some of that costs is through how they're inventorying and verifying the carbon. So yeah, if you're under 40 acres right now, I don't think there's any options. There used to be an option for if you had 1 acre or more, and that program does not exist. It went defunct. It was called NCX. And so that's just the lay of the land right now. And I will say, it is changing. Those cost share programs often do not have a minimum acreage, or it's like 5 acres. To get some of the cost share for doing carbon friendly management. So you might want to look into that if you're not eligible for a carbon offset program. Yeah, I don't know the question. There's a question about regulatory breakdown of these programs by federal, state, or local authorities. In the voluntary market, there isn't any. The Biden administration has been interested in having a more regulated national market for carbon offsets. Nothing has happened right now. They've provided some advice and some criteria, but yeah, that we really just have that regulated market. California, Washington, Canada has, there's some other places that have a regulated compliance market, but as far as us in New England, for forest carbon, it's really the voluntary market. So yeah, in New York, you have a program to plant, yeah, 25 million new trees. I have heard of this. Have they assessed how much carbon sequestration? I don't know. I think that's underway. That maybe SUNY ESF is working on that, is quantifying. They did release, SUNY ESF did some great carbon maps, high resolution carbon maps by scientists there for the state of New York that I wish we had in Vermont. They're great. And so I'm assuming someone's working on that. One thing with tree planting is challenging is you don't always have those trees survive. 50% survival is sort of a good benchmark. And then it also takes a while. A little sapling will take a while to really accrue carbon benefits. But, it's a great initiative. Being careful of like where those trees are put, not, taking over prime farmland or places like that. But, I really encourage folks, if you have room in your yard, plant some trees, and, in your town, encourage street trees, like great windbreaks. There's really lots of places we could probably put more trees and they provide a lot of other benefits too. A question about public landowners enrolling in these credit markets. So when I worked for the state of Vermont, we actually looked into, yes, public landowners can enroll, federal landowners not often eligible, but like state agencies, yeah, you're often eligible to enroll. We at the state of Vermont decided not to enroll. This was a number of years ago. Um, because we felt like it was hard to prove the additionality. We're already really doing exemplary forest management and had a lot of areas of reserves. And so we were challenged with feeling like we could justify the additionality because there wasn't going to be we couldn't really see where we could do a huge change in management from what we were doing then. And so that's just a big question. But yes, there are some examples of public lands enrolling in these carbon markets. Question about, does the sale of real land or passing on to inheritance have implications? Really depends. On the program. Ask that question. Usually the contract stays with the land. So usually you're selling the land with a carbon encumbrance. And so the new landowner is taking on that contract. But it can depend. So that's just a really good question to ask. And that looks like got everything. So thanks everyone for the great questions and yeah, being here.
All right, thank you, Allie. And I'll be in touch shortly with everyone with some recordings to share.
Great. All right. Take care.
Bye bye.